Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindup. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is just to move my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week prior and move into the process of writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason, and the second is just to allow you who have come across this video for whatever reason brought you here today to gain some insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these things. This particular Sunday, which is February 12th, 2017, the sixth Sunday after Epiphany, our gospel lesson comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 37. Just a word of where we are at. We have been in in Matthew chapter 5. This is now the third week, and we'll actually be there again next week too. During the year of Matthew, or year A, which is what the lectionary calls it, this overarching 3-year schedule, during this later period of the season of Epiphany, we always end up here in what's called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, pretty lengthy, actually covers all of chapters 5, 6, and 7. We will simply be in chapter 5, and then certain years, if Easter is later, in the springtime, then we'll get a little bit farther and we'll get into chapter 6. That's not the case this year, just because of the way that the church calendar falls after next week, which would be whatever date, the 19th, I believe. Then the final Sunday of February, which is the last Sunday before Lent kicks in. That's always Transfiguration Sunday. So that particular Sunday, whichever date that falls on, switches gears. But here we are in the midst of this period of teaching from Jesus. Now, as I mentioned, we've been there for a couple of weeks before. 2 weeks ago, even though I didn't focus on it within my sermon, we had the Beatitudes, which are the opening portion of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, blessed are these people. Typically, it's kind of understood as blessed are those who kind of have it rough now because it's going to get better for them. But it ends with the final one, as he's talking to his audience, mainly his disciples, but also his followers, and through the power of the written gospel to us as well. Blessed are you, and it's a specific thing. Blessed are you when they revile you and when they insult you because of my name, or Jesus' name, for they did the same thing to the prophets that came before you. I paraphrase that just a little bit. But so that happens, and that led us then into a reading for last week, which was then as Jesus starts to say, first that's you are salt and you are light. You can actually find my video from last week if you're interested in hearing more about that. But then Jesus switches into the law and the prophets, and he says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill them for you. And that was kind of the focal point of last week's gospel. And last week's video. Now, I'm going to probably overlap just slightly with the end of last week's and then into this one. Now, as I said before, the assigned text is out of Matthew 5. It's verses 21 through 37. I'm probably going to include verse 20 as well, which says, as Jesus is talking to his audience, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm probably going to include that because that's what, at least in my understanding, that's what this next section is about. Now we move into a period, sometimes they are called by scholars the antithesis, big fancy word that I don't really ever use, but basically talking about it's some different statements from Jesus, and we'll hear several of them, and then the rest of them will be next week. But we hear Jesus said, "You have heard it said in ancient times this, but I tell you this." And as I hear that, I mean, there's several different examples. The first one is murder. You've heard it said, "Do not commit murder," but I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, you have committed murder in your heart. And if you insult him, you're liable to judgment and liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," I'm actually reading it now, you're liable to the hell of fire. And that's kind of what we begin to see. Now, the reason, again, that I'm going to include that last verse, that verse 20, is because I think this is what Jesus is talking about as he says, the righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And the reason for that, and I believe I talked about this again in my last video, so check out the last one from a week ago, that the scribes and the Pharisees, who were like the religious elite, they were the ones who knew the law, the Jewish law, inside and out. They weren't perfect. That's not what Jesus is saying, and that's not what they would have been saying. But when they sinned, when they broke the law, they knew the right procedures to go through, the right sacrifice to make, the right prayer to pray, to atone for it, to make up for it. And what Jesus has told us over and over and over again, and the truth of the gospel is that we can't fulfill the law. And that's what this is about. That it's not just about, okay, well, if I break a rule, I can atone for it. I can make up for it. We can't. We just can't do it. And that's why God needs to step in to our reality through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and fulfill the law, fulfill the righteousness of the law on our behalf. And now this is why that is. We'll begin to see that. I've often thought that this portion of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount really speaks to the depth of sin, that it's not just our actions or our lack of action, but that it's it goes into our inner thoughts and our feelings and our intentions. It permeates every aspect of our life, of our reality. So that's kind of what this is aimed at. So now that I've been talking for 6.5 minutes, how about we jump in? Again, remember, I'm probably going to include verse 20, which I already said, and then we pick up here, and this is, of course, Jesus still talking. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you are liable to a hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for that is the throne of God, or by the earth, for that is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. All right, so that's the reading. Pretty lengthy. It's quite a bit that's in there. And again, it's different subjects. We've heard Jesus, he addresses murder and anger, and we see how the two are tied together. He addresses making repayment of debts. He whether financial or otherwise, and being reconciled. He talks about adultery and divorce and lust, and he talks about making oaths and false oaths, and do we swear on something or do we not, or do we say what we mean and do we mean it, and or do we not, and so it's kind of on, and there's definitely different themes. Any one of these little micro sections could be a sermon on its own, and so very likely I will not attempt to tackle all of them together. That would be foolish, or I would do none of them service. But what they all seem to point to, and I've talked about this with this passage before, probably 3 years back when it showed up in the lectionary the last time, was the idea that Jesus is saying, be reconciled. And in fact, that's one of the phrases in the Greek that really jumps out at me. Be reconciled to your brother. If your brother has something against you, be reconciled. Don't wait for them to come to you with the issue, but go and reconcile yourself to them. Be reconciled. Now, it's not easy. It requires effort on the part of the other person too. But we see all of that here is it seems to be about relationship. It's really about relationship. Murder definitely breaks a relationship, but anger damages a relationship, and insulting someone damages a relationship. If someone has something against you, there's a hindrance in the relationship, and if you owe them money, probably a hindrance there. Divorce is the breakdown of a relationship, and unfaithfulness is a breakdown of a relationship, and swearing false oaths breaks relationships, breaks agreements. And that seems to be what all this is about. But we see that even our intentions, even the things that we think perhaps are so minor, have effect, and have the effect of this broken relationship, which is evidence of sin in our reality. That sin breaks relationship, and most importantly, breaks our relationship with God. And that's why Jesus has come to fulfill righteousness for us on our behalf, because we can't accomplish it, and we see that here. So, kind of two different things at play within this portion. Really speaking to the depth of why we can't accomplish the law on our own, why our righteousness, our works righteousness, can never be enough, and also the glimpse at how sin breaks relationships, and that's what we need to be aware of. That's kind of where I'm going with this sermon. Need to do a little bit more work. You can perhaps tell if you're a normal viewer that my thoughts have not really super solidified yet, but that's kind of what's happening in this passage, what we're leading towards, what we're getting into, so that's kind of what I'm thinking. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, throw them down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week, and we will catch you next time.